Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Queensland Academy of Arts and Sciences webinar in the Data Science in the News series from QUT. And a good afternoon to everybody here. So today we're talking about after the COVID-19 pandemic, what have we learned? And we're talking about some good, bad, and ugly aspects of that. Before we commence, I'm just going to share my screen. So an acknowledgement of the country in which we're meeting. We acknowledge our traditional owners, their custodianship of the lands on which we meet. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So today we have been talking about, or we will be talking about 5 years after the pandemic and what we might have learned. So the WHO has been warning about possible pandemics for many, many years, especially after the SARS outbreak in the early 2000s. The COVID-19 pandemic was a major disruptor, though, and it's led to many changes at all levels of societies, and today we're going to talk about 3 of them. There's a lot of literature on the pandemic, but for those of you who don't wish to plow through that literature, we're just going to touch on some of those. So since it's now 5 years, it's a good time to think about what have we learned. Now, we published last year, but in 2023, the Queensland Academy produced a report about voices from the pandemic. And this was in conjunction with UQ Liver Scholars. It was listening to people at the front lines. And this report came up with 4 major themes, which related to planning and governance, to data, to communication, and to social and economic issues, identifying that pandemics are not simply about health. Last year, the federal government produced a summary report looking at how there was a response to the pandemic. This was at a different level to ours, as in the Queensland Academy. It wasn't about people on the ground, it was much more about systems. But these 2 reports have much in common in terms of the kinds of things that we should be doing. And for those who think it's going to be a long time till we see another one, just last Sunday, the ABC had a report that the pandemic is right around the corner and it's closer than we think, with the next bird flu pandemic, next SARS too, being in penguins and being in bird life very close to this country. So we think that it's timely to think about what we should be doing in our region and towards doing things better. Now, while we think the next pandemic is inevitable, there have been some very, very good things that came out. And we first of all want to hear about how the pandemic stimulated great growth in the vaccine developments, for example, because there was some unexpected consequences of the pandemic, and this was one of them. So our first speaker, before I get to him, if there are any questions, can you put them in the Q&A box on in the Zoom panel so that we can see those questions? The 3 speakers will have their presentations, and then after that there will be some time for answering questions. So if you do have them, please put them in that question box. So our first speaker today is Associate Professor Seth Cheetham. Now, Seth is an early career fellow and group leader at the Australian Institute for Bioengineering and Nanotechnology. He specialises in mRNA sciences, so vaccine developments, to develop the next generation of both vaccines and therapeutics. He did his Bachelor of Science Honours at UQ, and then he completed his PhD at Cambridge. Now, he is a specialist in molecular biology and genetics with a focus on synthetic biology, RNA medicines, and epigenetics. Goodness. So today he's going to talk about how the COVID, what's happened as a result of COVID in this extremely important field. So over to you, Seth.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, today I'd like to talk, I guess, to what I consider to be the silver lining of the pandemic, at least as it pertains to the development of medicines. And, certainly like when you're looking at, outcomes of the pandemic and things, it's very easy to get immersed in kind of the negative repercussions of it. But the good thing about science is that science, does inevitably always move forwards. While science policy may not always move forward, the science itself does always progress. And certainly, we've seen incredible progress in technologies that can enable us to both combat, existing health emergencies, but also potentially meet challenges of the future. So I'd like to start out by just kind of introducing what this mRNA technology that we've heard so much about in the context of the pandemic actually is. And so mRNA is a cousin of the molecule DNA, which many people will be familiar about, which contains our genes. So those genes contain instructions for telling our cells, which make up our body, whether to make particular molecules called proteins. So most of your body is made up of proteins, your skin, basically everything in a cell is made up of proteins. And so mRNA is this information carrying molecule that sits between the DNA, which is kind of like the hard copy of your genes, and those proteins, which are the functional molecules. And so it basically transmits the message from the DNA to make particular proteins. So this is a natural system that your own body uses to renew itself and to grow. And we can take advantage of this system by introducing an mRNA that encodes a protein that's not native to the human body. So in the case of a COVID vaccine, that's the spike protein. And then that can be delivered inside something, a little lipid, it's called like a fatty droplet, into cells, and then they'll start producing that spike protein. And what that enables is for your body to start recognizing that spike protein and mounting an immune response against it. And that basically trains your immune system so that when you're actually infected with a virus, then it will be able to mount a more effective defense because it knows what it's looking for. And this technology had been kind of developed over the course of several decades, but was dramatically accelerated in the context of the pandemic to kind of meet that emerging health threat. So, and the incredible thing about mRNA, I guess, rather than it necessarily making every vaccine better or anything like that, is the speed at which mRNA medicines can be developed. And you really saw this in the pandemic, in that many different approaches were used, including one at UQ, which I'll talk about later, to develop different vaccines. So mRNA is certainly not the only technology for vaccines. Most vaccines have been developed using other technology, but the reality is mRNA can do it faster. And so the development of the COVID-19 vaccines were faster than the development of any pharmaceutical product ever. And that was all done without actually cutting any corners whatsoever in terms of the development. So what's truly incredible about it is that on January 12th in 2020, the COVID SARS-CoV-2 sequence was published online by an Australian club with a Chinese collaborator. And the day afterwards, Moderna had designed their mRNA vaccine sequence. And they were able to basically put their first dose into patients in March. So that is incredibly fast for development of any kind of pharmaceutical product. And those vaccines, both from BioNTech, Pfizer, and Moderna, were approved by the end of the year by the FDA. So previously, I think the fastest developed vaccines had been several years. I think the fastest one before that was an Ebola vaccine, which had been developed in 2 or 3 years. But the norm is for them to take 5 to 10 years to develop. Now, there were some special things about COVID that made faster as well because it's easier to run a clinical trial if you have a lot of people that are getting infected. So you kind of reach the statistical endpoints much faster. But the incredible speed at which they were able to design and manufacture these mRNA vaccines really opens up a new way of doing both vaccines and therapeutics. And I guess in most of my talk, I'll talk about some of the kind of emerging applications of this technique, this approach. So while we have at the moment, so there's mRNA vaccines for COVID, and there's also an mRNA vaccine that's been approved in Australia for respiratory syncytial virus, which is a virus which particularly affects the elderly and the very young. There are a huge number of mRNA vaccines currently under development for a wide variety of diseases. And like I said before, they won't necessarily be effective against all these diseases, although some of them I really hope they would be effective against, like norovirus. Um, but what mRNA allows you to do is because it has that faster development time, it allows people to more quickly test mRNA vaccine candidates. And so this really speeds up the development process. So mRNA is not necessarily a magic bullet. It's not going to turn something that's a really difficult target like HIV that people have tried to develop vaccines against it for decades. It won't necessarily ensure its success there, but it will allow more different companies and academic groups to test different candidates more quickly, which will hopefully, in the end, lead to more successful vaccines. I want to shift gear a little bit and I guess talk about some of the newer applications of mRNA where we're moving away from the paradigm of infectious diseases and seeing what else we can do with this new technology. And one that my team is particularly focused on is using mRNA technology to fight against cancer. So in the context of an infectious disease vaccine, what you're trying to do is prevent infection, or if it doesn't prevent infection, at least reduce the severity of an infection when it accumulates. What cancer vaccines are trying to do are enhance immune recognition of cancer cells. So your immune system, it's much easier for your immune system to look at something that's very different, like a virus or a bacteria, and say, okay, that doesn't belong in the body, let's kill it. But to recognize cancer cells, which are just altered forms of your own cells, is a much more difficult prospect. But what we hope is that with cancer vaccines, we can stimulate the immune system to better be able to recognize those cancer cells and when it finds them, kill them. What this really rapid nature of mRNA design and manufacture enables us to do is actually design these vaccines for single individuals. So during the COVID pandemic, you saw the incredible ability of this technology to mobilize and generate billions of doses to vaccinate entire populations. But you can actually scale down and go in the opposite direction in which you're making a drug for a single individual. And what this does is it actually uses the unique information about an individual's tumor. So two different people might have breast cancer or colon cancer or any other kind of cancer, but the cancer that they have is actually unique to them, and it will be quite different to how it is in a different individual. And that information is contained within the DNA of the tumor. So cancer is actually really a genetic disease in which you get changes in the DNA that cause the cells to behave differently. And we can actually use that information and to design a vaccine to stimulate immunity against that specific cancer. So this is true personalized medicine in which you're designing and manufacturing a drug just for one person. So this all sounds like science fiction, and to be totally honest, a few years ago it sounded like science fiction to me too. But this is actually being evaluated in clinical trials at the moment. So you don't have to take too much away from this graph, but this is just from a clinical trial in melanoma. And essentially, people that were treated with an mRNA vaccine in red are living for much longer than those that get the standard of care treatment in blue. So what this has done is in this phase 2 trial, which is kind of a mid-stage clinical trial, so it still has to go to a larger population, but it's very encouraging. And it shows that you're cutting the risk of death or recurrence of a cancer by half compared to what is currently the state-of-the-art treatment. And the nice thing about this technology is it's potentially applicable to any kind of cancer. These are also very safe treatments relative to conventional cancer treatments, which tend to have a lot of side effects. And there's actually no difference if you add the mRNA vaccine to the current treatment strategy. I wanted to kind of just finish off in terms of these emerging treatments by talking about something that actually just happened last week, which was not treating cancer in a personalized way, but actually treating genetic diseases in a personalized way. So this very cute baby here on the screen was diagnosed with a genetic condition where they have one of their genes is faulty that produces a protein that's essential for life. And essentially, these children are at high risk of brain damage because they build up a toxic chemical in their bloodstream when they get infected. And so what scientists were able to do is to design a mRNA that would go into that child's cells, into the liver, and actually correct that mutation. So this is basically not coming in with a drug, but they're actually rewriting the DNA of the liver cells of this baby to fix the inherited cause faulty gene. So what this did was this actually resulted in that baby recovering and being able to basically have normal metabolism again, which is an incredible feat. And again, is something that's really only been enabled by the incredible speed at which you can develop these mRNA medicines. So this baby went from birth to being treated with a personalized therapy within 7 months, which is a feat that has never before been accomplished. And so this is really tailoring medicines to single individuals. I'd just like to finish up by talking about the Australian perspective, which is what are we doing in Australia to enable these kind of technologies? And I guess coming from the UQ perspective, a lot of this was really catalyzed by the UQ's COVID vaccine program, which didn't use mRNA, but used a different technology called a molecular clamp. And that really actually kind of paved the way by showing how researchers at universities could collaborate with industry leaders and national infrastructure to really quickly advance new vaccine candidates. And this vaccine candidate was very effective, but was ultimately discontinued due to the success of the COVID mRNA vaccines. But what this really did was kind of galvanize the Queensland, particularly, but also Australian research community, and kind of gave us a sense of what is possible, that we can actually develop new medicines within the university system with key partners. And to talk about, I guess, the good that's come out of the pandemic is this is what the Australian landscape for mRNA looks like at the moment. So we have world-leading companies here, Sanofi, BioNTech, and Moderna, who are three of the leaders in mRNA technology. But we also have this whole infrastructure of different academic groups, including ours, around Australia, as well as homegrown startups that are kind of using this technology. So for when I think about the good that's come out of the pandemic, it's really the development of these new technologies and this whole translational infrastructure, which will allow us to take advantage of mRNA medicines, but will also enable us to rise to the challenge of meeting future pandemics should they arise. Thanks very much.
So thank you very much for that overview, Seth. And that is a wonderful story. I mean, that is, I guess, just very quickly, would this have happened if the COVID pandemic had not happened?
It might have happened eventually, but I think it wouldn't have happened for at least another decade, shouldn't, if we hadn't had the COVID pandemic, because the pandemic was just kind of a showcase of this technology on the largest possible global stage. So it stimulated a huge amount of investment, both from governments, but also from companies into that technology.
That's great. So thanks very much for that. Well, that's the good. Now we wanted to go on and talk about the bad, if you like, which were unexpected longer term outcomes. Now, across society, there have been many, and they're across things. There's been change in economic activity, about the way people interact, the way mental health has or has not been affected. But we're now going to move on to Robert Tyndall, talking about long COVID and long vax, the science, the sufferers, and the medical profession. Now, Robert is an emeritus professor at UQ. Principal interest is in immunology and virology, having served for some years working on the papillomavirus vaccines and the actual virus itself. He's authored many papers in this area, including a late one on long COVID, a very recent one last year on long COVID. he sits on many advisory bodies and committees, and he's held a lot of NH and MRC funding over the years in the area of immunology and virology. So I'm just going to hand over to Robert now to talk about these more negative outcomes, long-term outcomes from the pandemic. Thanks, Robert.
Fairly on in the piece, in fact, about 3 or 4 years ago, in about 2021, 2022 time, some quite unexpected medical consequences were presenting themselves to people who had suffered an acute bout of an acute bout of COVID infection. And the symptomology of this new syndrome, so to speak, was quite different from the COVID, which was essentially a respiratory virus, really. And soon this was reported first on social media, and then the medical profession took it up. And the current state of the game is, with this new insidious syndrome, there are currently an estimated 1.1 million sufferers in the UK and 17 million sufferers in the US. And World Health Organization defines long COVID as it's a set of symptoms which begin about 3 months after the initial infection with SARS-CoV, and lasting for at least 12 weeks afterwards. The definition in the EU lines. And if you estimate the number of people who've been vaccinated, if you estimate the number of people who suffered long COVID globally, which is thought to be about 400 million, a good proportion of them, about 1 in 10 of those people, will suffer this long COVID symptomology. Now, the Australian Bureau of Statistics doesn't keep tabs on the number of long COVID sufferers in Australia, but it's estimated that there are about 240,000 people in Australia suffering from this post-COVID phenomenon, which is absolutely detrimental to the national economy, because so many of these people who have this long COVID phenomenon find themselves quite unable to work. And there was the governmental inquiry into long COVID in 2023. And that inquiry was informed by submission by all interested parties, in as much as that all state health departments, all hospitals in effect, were invited to make submissions to the inquiry, saying what they were seeing and what measures they were taking. Now, and it included submissions from individual patients and just about all submissions, I think there were 159, if I remember correctly, a lot of submissions. All of them verified that they had experience of long COVID and that it was a very real phenomenon. All except the Queensland government, which in its wisdom played down long COVID to the point where it eventually took the stance that really long COVID doesn't exist in Queensland. And the reason it doesn't exist is because we were so terribly good at controlling the acute phase of the pandemic that no one went on to get long COVID here in Queensland. Aren't we good here? I.e., they said it was a nocebo effect, an effect of post-pandemic stress and so forth. Both diagnoses are in the 30 to 50-year-old age group, and the incidence of long COVID is somewhat higher for those who've suffered the Omicron or the Delta variants. So the risk factor for getting long COVID are sex. The females are more predisposed to succumb to long COVID than males. Yeah, another risk factor is more severe COVID infection. It does appear that the more serious your bout of acute disease was, the worse your long COVID, if you get it, is going to be. So long COVID then, it's formally called long COVID now, although it has been known as post-acute sequelae of COVID-19, or PASC. Well, how does it manifest itself? The symptoms are rather insidious, ranging from microclots, clotting, blood coagulopathy, where clots occur in the lungs, in the liver, and elsewhere. And of course, blood clots in any cardiovascular vessel are potentially very serious. From the patient's point of view, often the worst manifestations of it is extreme fatigue, and especially post-exertional malaise. People find themselves, not only unable to exercise, but unable to work. Shortness of breath, often chest pain, and many complain of brain fog, which is almost a diagnostic feature of the disease, i.e. your brain becomes so befuddled that you can't think clearly somehow. But symptoms differ significantly from person to person. The symptoms fluctuate, so a lot of long COVID people say, oh, I thought I was getting better, but then I relapsed and it all started all over again. And in some senses, it's very similar. It has similarities with chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, an alarming report recently is that there's an enhanced risk of cardiovascular disease at 12 months post-COVID infection. That's stroke or heart failure, transient ischemic events. And it isn't short-lived. The World Health Organization says if it lasts for 12 weeks, that's clearly long COVID. People are reporting being long COVID symptomology lasting months and even years, 1 year, 2 year duration of this incapacity. Now, thinking of the long COVID patient for the moment. The long COVID patient has an uphill struggle. What has happened historically, and what's really still happening to a certain extent today, is that if you think you've got long COVID and you rock up to your GP and say, look, I'm absolutely wiped out, and I've got my heart's going up and down, and I've got all sorts of other symptoms too. GPs either listen patiently and then tell you that, and the ability to nail it down at the primary healthcare level usually results in the patient being sent off for various imaging procedures in order to get some more diagnostic information. And the imaging, the heart, usually the coronary imaging, which is a common one, comes back to the GP as being unremarkable. There seems to be nothing wrong with this individual. And so the pronouncement is then often made to the patient, oh, well, what you're suffering from is post-pandemic stress. Or what you're suffering, the other favorite one, what you're really suffering from is anxiety. Oh yes, hell, I'm suffering from anxiety. You tell me. So what long COVID patients frustrated at both primary and secondary healthcare is that they go doctor shopping. They go from doctor to doctor to doctor to try to get a diagnosis. And the diagnosis is often not forthcoming because a firm diagnosis of long COVID is not set in place yet. No one quite knows what is going on. The pathogenesis just simply hasn't been worked out yet. And so the patient gets obviously very frustrated at this. And so many of them say that the only place they felt safe and where they could get information was from long COVID support groups. And these have sprung up like mushrooms all around the world. There's quite an active one in Australia with thousands of people enrolled. And on this long COVID support groups, they can hear the experiences of other fellow sufferers and what they have found is helpful for them. So what often ends up is a long COVID patient ends up trying out a lot of, anecdotal therapy, which they can get from the long COVID support groups. And some of them, these things are quite expensive. And what it amounts to is some patients reporting spending considerable amounts of monies, and going down the try this, try that, try the other thing, to ameliorate their symptoms. It often doesn't work. But there again, what they do have in the long COVID support group is fellow sufferers who are on the same journey and who are talking about what's the way forward here. Well, so the effects of long COVID are not only on the patient, they not only faced by patients, but they're faced by healthcare providers, obviously. Effect on economies is not, on their personal long COVID sufferers' economies is quite high. And an insidious thing is that in the absence of getting a firm diagnosis, the long COVID patient is not eligible for governmental support systems which are in place, because without a firm diagnosis, that's a quid that's a sine qua non. You've got to have that in order to get aid. Now that on a societal level, families are infected. People report relationships are affected. Obviously, social life is virtually non-existent in these people, and they can't exercise because of the malaise which comes from exercising. Now, it's not surprising on a societal level that, the reality of it is that the powers that be, that the health administrators really don't know what they're dealing with. Because the pathogenesis of the disease isn't worked out, and there's no firm treatment options, it's scarcely surprising then that the health administrators, they don't know what they're dealing with. And what this means is that there's been only minimal high-level planning associated with long COVID. And sufferers report, even at 2 years after succumbing to long COVID, they still cannot get anyone to give them a firm diagnosis.
Your time's just about up, Robert.
Okay, so what has emerged is that there's a second phenomenon, and the second phenomenon is that the long COVID, which results from infection, seems to be mimicked in many ways by long COVID mRNA vaccines. In as much as that there's now quite good data emerging that people who have had no primary COVID infection whatsoever are going on to get this syndrome, which is called post-vax, which fundamentally mimics long COVID. And although the pathogenesis isn't worked out, the prime suspect for the pathology due to long COVID is the spike protein. Well, and as Seth has pointed out, it all makes good sense to target the spike protein with vaccines. But the downside of giving a genetic an RNA vaccine is that what you're doing is you're giving the body, if you receive the vaccine, what you are receiving is a piece of nucleic acid which is translating the hard copy of the gene into the protein. And so what it's making is more spike protein. Now, the dangers that have been mooted, and that there's now a fair academic literature on this, is that, first of all, the mRNA, which you receive in an mRNA vaccine, hangs around for quite a long time. And even a year after vaccination, mRNA can still be detected in recipients of the vaccine. And the spike protein can be detected for about 6 months.
Can you please finish up
Yep.
now? Yeah, thanks very much.
Okay, so there are some things that have to be learned and taken into account in the health administration of long COVID, be it either from the vaccine or from natural infection. It's a serious problem. There's mammoth effort going on in the United States, where a lot of money has been devoted to cracking what long COVID is and what the therapeutic pathway is forward. Not because they're sorry for the patients, but because it's affecting the national economy. 1 person in 5 in the UK, for example, reports that they're not back to work, having had suffering long COVID for a couple of years. So once governments start talking about economies, one can feel confident that something's going to be done about it. And so I'll wind it up there. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Robert. I know we're just getting a little bit tight on time here, but that's good. Now, this is, of course, that's covering some of the unexpected but negative outcomes of the COVID pandemic, which were not foreseen. Now, as I said at the introduction, this is not simply about health. And our third speaker today is going to talk on the communication issue. So Emeritus Professor Roland Sussex is going to be talking on COVID-19 and the compromising of the word. Now, Roland was Professor of Russian at the University of Melbourne. I'm not sure that's a positive, but Professor of Applied Language Studies at the University of Queensland. And since they're leaving the university, he's been researching intercultural communication and medical communication and pain. He's been presenting weekly broadcasts on the ABC for 27 years. Now, one of our areas that our report highlighted was about communication. And so over to you, Roland.
In the modern world, we are deluged with language, particularly through the digital media. And the information we get is most effective when it's full, frank, and civil. When the pandemic was announced officially on March the 11th in 2020, we had a kind of honeymoon period when people behaved themselves in language, and it actually functioned like a megaphone, bringing out some of the best aspects of people living in the face of a very, very threatening enemy. So for about 6 months, while the vaccines were under development, people were pretty cooperative in what they did with their language. The political parties refrained from politicizing the whole thing. And in fact, there was a kind of national consensus that this was something we had to deal with in a cohesive way. Citizens did their lockdown and their quarantine and their physical distancing, not social distancing, by the way. That was a bad term that the WHO asked us to change. And digitally, we were able to keep in contact with members of our family, even if we were in quarantine, because of digital resources. Unfortunately, about 6 months in, things started going bad and the megaphone started amplifying negative aspects. They were already present before COVID, but COVID accelerated the way in which these things became evident, normalized, and in fact quite pernicious. There were bitter attacks on scientists, medical personnel, politicians, police, administrators, for trying to do their job, really. Our public messaging was confused and inconsistent, and even between states in Australia. And there was a lot of changing advice, whether vaccines were good, whether masks were worth it. And science at the time actually didn't know the answers to these questions. And according to the then head of the National Institutes of Health in the US, it would have been a great deal of help if they had actually fessed up and said, we don't know yet, we're doing our best. So during COVID, things started going bad in about the first 9 months. And after that, they became incredibly mixed up. And the digital communications, I'm afraid, were among the most guilty. In a population of 8.1 billion on the planet, about 60%, over 5 billion, have access to social media. And the social media took up a great deal of the weight of communication. Notice, by the way, that the web is the biggest thing we ever had for a communicating medium. It's got no governing body, no legislation, and it's anarchic in the old Greek sense of anarchos, no leader. And therefore, what happens is basically what happens on the ground and can propagate through the system really quickly and badly. This is rather important because 8 out of 10 Americans get their news from digital sources, and things like echo chambers and filter bubbles, which mean you lock yourself into a particular political view of the news, tends to happen quite quickly. President Trump talked about fake news a great deal during these months, undermining the credibility of journalism in the US and elsewhere. And in fact, he did say that one of his goals was to make people mistrust the journalism they read. There are various sorts of misinformation around, and one is the word misinformation itself, which means the thing is not true, but you may not know it's so. Disinformation is deliberate misleading of people with stuff that you know to be untrue. It's malevolent. But in addition to that, we now have deep fake, where audio, video, and text can be produced to be very much like the original, and takes a great deal of expertise to try and sort it out. In 2024, the Korean general election was taking place, and a bit of film came around where the Prime Minister was saying, "I, Yoon Suk-yeol, have been enforcing laws that harass our nation. I ruined our country and made its people suffer by clinging on to an ideology that deviates from common sense." It was absolute rubbish. He never said it, but it had been put together by someone on the opposition, or possibly someone overseas who was trying to mix up with their electoral process. There is, however, a fourth sort of misinformation, and this we've decided to call humbug. In a paper of 1986, Harry Frankfurt called it by the BS word. Sandra and I decided that we were going to be decorous about this. But humbug is when the speaker doesn't know about the truth of what he's saying, but doesn't care and utters it anyhow because it suits their rhetorical goals or the way they want to come across. And I'm afraid the has enormously accelerated during COVID, not only on social media, but particularly on social media and on many levels. So a message may be totally humbug, it may be 50% humbug. Working out exactly what is extraordinarily difficult. Because, as Peter Gresti, the journalist, told me, we've lost our 3 trusted sources of information: the universities, good journalism, and the public service, all of which have become somewhat compromised under COVID. And so when we get something to consume as bits of science, we're not actually sure how to evaluate it. I've got 2 slides which I want to show you now to make this point. In the 17th century, poor old Galileo, who died in 1642, built himself a telescope and worked out that, unlike what the church was saying, the Earth was not the center of the universe. In fact, it was, if anything, the sun, the heliocentric view. He was taken to court by the Inquisition and threatened with torture unless he recanted. In this period, as you can see on the screen, science and knowledge and religion and values and government were really locked into one part of the story, and the church was able to basically filter any kind of science of which it disapproved. And Galileo was going against Holy Writ and risking a great deal. Eventually he did recant, but the story is that as he left the altar where he'd recanted, he said, "E per si muove," which in Italian means, but it does move. And he had, I'm afraid, house arrest for the rest of his natural life. When we get to COVID, things have got much more complicated. Science and knowledge represent one axis of a triangle. Religion, values, and government in another, and religion is sometimes mixed up with it and sometimes not, in parts of the US very closely so. And the third one is the common people. We've got bidirectional arrows, and information was flowing along all of these. And it did so extraordinarily effectively in the eradication of smallpox in 1980, which was the only disease that has ever been declared completely vanquished. Now, what happened under COVID was that a lot of stuff was shuttling around, and it was very difficult to find out whether it was humbug or genuine. And a lot of groups like the anti-vaxxers were claiming that they had scientific proof that the vaccines were doing bad things. There were even stories that they were full of microchips put there by Bill Gates and some other weird stories. So if you think about this triangle as being something which was getting rapidly perverted during COVID, I'm afraid this is part of the way in which we lost control of really decent information, and it started being a real problem for everybody. Okay, can you see me again now? Okay, so we've got COVID, which is unfortunately gaining speed. The vaccine rollout brought up a great deal of confrontation. The Chinese were accused of deliberately letting COVID out of the lab in Wuhan, and the whole thing got rather badly politicized. You may remember there was an awful fight, very public, between President Trump and Dr. Fauci, who was head of the Infectious Diseases Office of the US, and around things which it would have been very difficult, very easy to do some kind of more consistent story. Vaccines and blood clots. Yes, there were blood clots associated with at least one of the vaccines. Was it very largely a very large number? No, not at all. Over quarantine and wearing masks and social distancing, we simply didn't know what the effect of these was going to be. And in spite of bodies like Snopes, which is an American fact-checking body and provides good scientific and factual reports about things which are said in public, it was very difficult to find out what was going on and to work out where the humbug began and ended. Wasn't helped by the fact that in 2023, 10,000 academic papers, which had been accepted for publication in reputable journals, had to be withdrawn on the grounds of being written by AI or humbug or being simply bad. So we were stuck in a problem where we really didn't know how to find the truth for a long while, and there were people who were trying to muddy the waters. That's part one of my story. Part two involves interpersonal communication. This had to do with face-to-face contacts, which of course were very much limited by the whole COVID thing, and which restricted our contact and forced us to wear masks, which are a great problem when we're trying to communicate with the parts of our face that do a lot of the work. There are bits of non-verbal communication which are called voice work, where things like tone of voice and so on can have a great deal to do with the veracity or not of what you say, but also body work. And this, I'm afraid, during our experience with COVID was interrupted. We had become in Australia a much more touchy-feely lot than we used to be. But over COVID, we kind of had to draw back again, and people found that they were trying to communicate at a distance of 1.5 meters or more, and we lost the kind of warm interpersonal communication that we'd had. Emotional intelligence struggles under these conditions, and so does our ability to do accommodation. A lot of people did learn to use the digital communication things. There were meetings which took place with Zoom. There were also Gin and Zoom meetings, which made things a little social, even though you were not physically in the same place. But I'm afraid after COVID, we have inherited a tradition of rather bitter personal and interpersonal communication. A lot of public communication is now rather toxic, and humbug is much more prevalent than it used to be. We know that under the conditions of a political election, there will be more humbug, but now it's coming out from all sorts of leaders and spokespeople around the world. Part of this also is associated with polarization. In America, they've suffered extreme polarization of their channels of communication, to the point where 1 in 10 American marriages or partnerships break up because of political disagreement. And this is very, very sad. Some of the recent studies have said that the US is a particularly troubling case because it's the only advanced Western democracy that has suffered such high degrees of polarization for such an extended period. And in fact, humbug has become normalized. So that is extremely difficult, extremely problematic, and very difficult to turn around. Trying to put things to rights is difficult. There are 3 elephants in the room. One is AI, which is being used to mess up communication, to interfere with other people's democratic and other processes, as we found recently in the election in Romania. Second is the next global disaster, as Sandra said, which is certainly coming. H5N1 is close, very close to Australia and could do very bad things to a lot of things in this country. And the third is the First Amendment to the US Constitution, which is about freedom of speech. It's a very noble principle, but as someone from MIT said recently, freedom of speech is not necessarily the same as freedom of spread. And so attempts to manage what is going out through freedom of speech faces some quite difficult challenges in different areas. The report that Sandra referred to, called Voices from the Pandemic, talked about guardrails and attempts to try and limit things like racism and violence and criminal activity, which are currently very imminent on the social media, and young people in particular are being trolled, and the numbers of people, young women in particular, doing either suicide or self-harm are really very, very sad. What we think we ought to be doing is preparing now for what's going to happen next time, because it is certainly coming. There's a thing called a warm base, which comes from disaster planning, which says that we should have structures, people, and processes which are regularly rehearsed, ready to go, and which can be implemented at the drop of a hat, because we are certainly going to have another one. We need to do something about reinventing face-to-face communication. If you go to a coffee shop, you will find people sitting around a table with their phones, sending messages to each other with no eye contact at all. There are models of education, particularly in Finland, where they've got a very nice program of digital and social and civic literacy. But unless we can cancel humbug, I'm afraid we're going to be left with a source of information which is going to be very bad for everybody. Thank you.
So thank you, Ron. Now we're just on, I'm just going to show you the report again. So here is the website where you can get our report down. The difference between our report and the federal report is it's got stories from people on the ground. So I have a question for Seth, which just follows on from what Rolly was saying. We recommended in here that we prepare, that we keep a preparation, calling it a warm base, things bubbling along in the background ready to go. The vaccine development was truly remarkable in its speed. So could you give us very briefly, 3 words, what were the key success factors? That's to Seth.
Sorry, the key success, sorry, could you?
Factors for the speed of the vaccine development.
Yeah.
You talked about the fact that it's the technology, but what else?
Yeah, so a lot of the advantages in terms of speed come from the technology itself, because they're essentially, it's a bit scientific, but it's mainly that mRNAs are essentially all manufactured in exactly the same way. So it doesn't matter what the mRNA is for, you can pretty much always make them in the same way. Whereas for other kinds of vaccines, you need more of a bespoke, tailored approach to manufacturing them. So they're not all going to behave exactly the same. So that's how companies like Pfizer and Moderna that were working on other kinds of vaccines were really able to quickly ramp up and start making mRNA vaccines for COVID. But I think also like something that I touched on and it's been a bit lost in the conversation is, also the circumstances of the pandemic also allowed these trials to proceed incredibly quickly because of the number of people that were getting infected. It was very easy to rapidly see whether the vaccine was working or not because you saw really quick splitting of the people that had been vaccinated and those that hadn't been. I think this is something that will only improve upon from the experience of the pandemic. I think we're getting much more efficient at running clinical trials. And certainly Australia has a really world-leading network of clinical trials to really advance the development of this technology.
Okay, thanks very much, Seth. And just a final comment from Rolly. If you could implement 3 things to counter this mis and disinformation that came out of things like the pandemic, what would they be?
First thing was, well, first 2 were recommended by the Voices from the Pandemic report, a national data governance framework, which people can access, which they trust, and which they know is going to give them full and frank and comprehensive information about things they need to have. Second, a national centre for disease prevention and control. There needs to be some place where we can go, where we know what therapies are necessary, how to behave, and so on. And the third is that I think we can take some heart from what has happened. For the first 6-9 months of COVID, we behaved admirably in a communication sense, and we were cohesive, we were collegial, we were supportive, and we were friendly. What went wrong after that tells us how vulnerable we were to misuse of this medium. And I think what we now need to do is some very serious bottom-up planning on a civil basis to work out how we are going to force the digital communications to be for the good of us and not for our ill.
And on that comment, we'll bring this to a close. But I think you've heard today, we've been talking about some of the very good aspects that we've learned from the pandemic and changes that have occurred, some of the poorer aspects in the health, the long-term health outcomes that were both unexpected and not, and some of the issues with the communication and our social interactions and that misinformation. However, I do think we've got hopeful outcomes, and I think that these hopeful outcomes do demonstrate innovation, collaboration, and there has been, I think, improvements in governance. I do suggest any of you interested in the pandemic to read our report. It has vignettes and stories from the ground, which illustrate that failure to communicate clearly, the failure for everybody to be on the same page, different uses of data, different interpretations of the same data. But out of that has come a hopeful, and we sincerely hope we're prepared for the next inevitable pandemic. So thank you for your attendance today, and thank you to all of our speakers, and for those of you who sent in questions. Thanks very much, and to QUT for hosting us. So goodbye for now.